Hey guys, welcome back to Chariot Palmistry. My name is Sulabh Jain, and this is the fourth video in a series I've called the most important video series I'm ever going to make. This video is going to be more or less a Q&A, answering a lot of the specific questions that you guys had in the previous three videos in this series. So let's jump straight into this. Just as a quick recap to bring you guys up to speed, the previous three videos, I went off the thesis that we're actually beginning a new age right now. So if there's four takeaways that you guys need to have from the previous videos, it's the fact that the industrial age is declining, that the information age is taking over, and that this transition is going to cause a lot of chaos around the world. Not only that, but this transition cannot be stopped. So to jump into this video, let me just say that most of the questions that you guys asked on that video series were actually very practical in nature. You were asking, what should I do for my family? Where should we set up our home? And things like that. There weren't a lot of questions on the philosophy or the history content itself. And I'm actually kind of happy about that because that means I did a pretty good job in conveying the basics of what I was trying to talk about to you guys. So for this series, I'll keep adding videos to this series in the years ahead, just to keep you ahead of the curve of the changes that are coming. Meaning the practical steps I want you to take now may or not be useful in the years ahead. So we'll keep updating this content over time. One of the most common questions that we got was, what are the best and safest countries to live in? So remember, I'm predicting a series of wars in the years ahead, or two in particular, after a financial calamity in late 2026, early 2027. There should be another war around about a year or two after that time. Then I'm predicting an even bigger war toward the end of the 2030s and the early 2040s. So in order to say safe during this time, I want you guys to have two different viewpoints here. Think long-term first and then think short-term. Meaning, if you think long-term, think in terms of the next several generations of your family. Where will you guys be the happiest, and where are you most likely to prosper? Once you have that in mind, then you can shift your thinking to the short term. So I had a lot of questions about, because in the previous series I talked about this one particular country being good or another country being good for a different reason. A lot of you guys asked, well, what about my country? Now, I can't list and answer each and every single country here. What I'd like to do instead for you guys is give you kind of an overview of the world. In the previous videos, we talked about finding a country with a good information age infrastructure, or a good education system, or a good stable democracy. If you can just find a country with two out of those three things, you guys should be pretty good. But let me break down the world in terms of continents and regions, just to give you, I suppose, another holistic way of looking at things. Now, we got a lot of comments from people in Austria saying, in the previous video, we talked about how Germany had such a good education system. And you guys are asking, well, what about us? And the answer is, well, I think you guys are pretty similar to Germany as far as I can tell. Divide Europe up into three regions, right? You've got, let's say, Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. During the end of the industrial age, Western Europe, meaning England, France, Spain, and maybe we could add Portugal to that mix, those countries did exceptionally well because of the Industrial Revolution. Started in England, went to France, then to Spain, and obviously into Portugal as well. From there, it spread into the New World. That's the reason that most of the world today speaks a combination or one of these four languages. Now, those countries did great in the industrial age, but they're not really developing the information age, the next generation for the information age. That's why we can generally predict that they'll be in the decline in the years ahead. Now, the Central Europeans, they've got a very, very good very good education system. So not just the Germans and the Austrians, but I think the Scandinavian countries really do as well. They put a lot of emphasis on their kids and their education. Serbia, that whole general region of Central Europe, I think, should be doing well in the years ahead. And it's just off the simple observation that they actually want their kids to learn something. Now, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc, I think a lot of those places are still recovering from the Cold War. There's a lot of government ineptitude that goes on in a lot of those regions, and you can see some of this with the Ukraine-Russia war going on at the moment. I had no idea that Ukraine had so much corruption going on until foreign countries started sending their money over there to fight the war. It's just a lot of nonsense bureaucracy happening. I'd like to think those places will do well in the years ahead, but there's just no way to know that for sure. So to sum up Europe, or how I think that's going to go, I think the Central European countries will do great. The Eastern European countries have a lot of catching up to do. And the Western European countries most likely are going to be declining in the centuries ahead. So that's one region. What about Africa? You look at the economies of most African countries, and they're not based on the information age. They're actually based around mining, meaning, ideas that were from the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. So Africa has a long, long way to go to catch up to the rest of the world. And I know I'm talking about a huge region with just like a single one-sentence analysis here, but it's generally not looking like it's going to be competitive with, let's say, America in the years ahead. South America, on the other hand, I'm actually very optimistic about. Believe it or not, South Americans have a huge tech startup culture over there. And again, I'm talking in stereotypes about a whole region, but I think a lot of the big companies in the years ahead are most likely going to come out of South America. Just as at the moment, the biggest companies in the world come out of the US, the South Americans will be competitive, or maybe even in the years ahead, start to overtake the American companies here. Same with the Indian companies and the Chinese companies too. So South America, I think, actually has a really good future ahead. Their education system isn't as advanced as the Central Europeans, but there's still a lot of good over there. And then the last region I was asked a lot about was the Middle East. And this one isn't really looking too good. Now, stereotypically, most Middle Eastern economies work off of one of three areas. Either it's mining, specifically for oil, which I think is a declining industry in the years ahead, meaning those countries that are based off that economy should be collapsing. That's one area. Then there's tourism and also finance. And the finance industry, I think, is going to get shaken up big time in the years ahead. So Middle Eastern countries can't rely on that. That just leaves tourism. So one industry out of three, and that too the weakest of the three. So I'm not very optimistic on the Middle East, but that's just my general armchair analysis here on the best countries in the world for the long, long term. Remember, you want to pick a country that's stable, relatively stable, because in the years ahead, no country is going to be stable. But you also want a country with a good education system, and a country that's looking forward and building its information age infrastructure. Now, let's talk about the war. One question I got a lot is, where in the world is safe? And again, to answer this question, think short term. So previously we were talking about the best countries, or the best, I shouldn't say best, that's not the right word, the most prosperous countries in the years ahead over several generations. Now we need to think short term. And there are two specific windows of time that I want you guys focused in on. The period from 2027, 28, and maybe the couple years after that, and also 2038 to 43. I think there's going to be two big wars during this time frame. Now, the war in 26-27, I think, is going to be after a financial crisis, and as best as I can tell, it's going to be in Southeast Asia. Now, let me clarify what I mean by Southeast Asia, because this could trip up a lot of people. I believe that India is the energetic center of the world, and I've been able to predict a lot of wars happening in the world relative to India, meaning north, east, south, or west. And a couple of years ago, I predicted a war happening northwest of India. At the time, I thought that was going to be either Pakistan or Afghanistan. So those are the countries northwest of India. Instead, the war started out in Ukraine, so further northwest of there. So in palmistry and astrology, we don't read specific countries, we can only read directions. So when I say there's a war in Southeast Asia, I mean that there's a war east to southeast of India. That could include Australia, it could be, I don't know, any number of countries just in that region, even New Zealand. So don't hold me to the Southeast Asia area specifically. All I can say is that there's going to be a big war, most likely in that region, and everyone in the world is going to be affected. Just as everyone in the world has been affected by the Ukraine war, pushing up the price of oil, or the Israel-Palestine war, which has also done a similar thing as well. Now, where in the world is safe? Look, if you live in Southeast Asia, then you probably want to be looking at having an exit strategy of some kind here. Maybe a second passport or something along those lines where you can just safely travel to another country for a few years. Don't think of the world as ending, like in an apocalyptic sense. Just think of this in terms of safety. If the proverbial does hit the fan, you want to be able to get on a plane and go someplace safe. But I'd say that precaution is only really needed for Asia or Southeast Asia, including Australasia and the Pacific Islands, I suppose. Now that's one point. I suppose the other point is also to rely on your karma and your own energy. You see, you can be safe in the most dangerous places in the world if your energy is pure. And at the same time, you can be unsafe in the safest places in the world if your energy isn't. And to give you guys an example of that, I'll just maybe talk about my own channel over here. We do predictions about the cryptocurrency markets, about the stock markets, commodities, and things like that. And I get messages from you guys. One person in particular sent me a message with a lot of thank yous in it, saying that he's been able to send 2 of his kids through college because of the predictions that I gave him. I got a message from another guy, very upset with me. He lost $160,000 on cryptocurrencies. So it's like 2 people were given the exact same predictions. One guy was able to secure his children's future. Another guy lost a lot of money. And the only answer you can have for such extreme opposite results here is just their karma and their own energy. That's what I'd get you guys to focus back on. The world may go crazy, and it probably will, but if your energy is centered and it's grounded, then you're going to be okay no matter where you are in the world. So that's one area. The big war that I suppose I don't have a name for it, but now I'll just call it the big war. I'm predicting that to be in 2038 to 43. And one of the predictions I made in a previous video was that there will be 1 billion people leaving the planet at that time. And one question that came up is, how could 1 billion deaths happen? Like, the world's population right now is 8 billion. So I'm saying we're going to lose 1 in 8 people. So let me just break this down a little bit. I suppose firstly, the world population in around about 2040 is estimated to be near 10 billion people. So I'm actually saying that 1 in 10 people will cease to exist at that point. But that's, 1 in 8 people leaving the world compared to 1 in 10. That's not much difference here. It's still a disaster, no matter how you look at it. But I want you guys to think historically here. Look at the Dark Ages and the major conflicts that happened in the world at that time. The War of the Three Kingdoms, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, that killed 20% of the world's population there. And the Mongols and their wars, they killed 10% of the world's population. And then the Black Plague, that killed 25% of the world's population. So my estimates are that 10% of the world will be leaving, and in the Dark Ages there were 3 events that were that catastrophic, if not more. Then in the Industrial Age, during the colonial wars, 15% of the world's population was killed. the flu and influenza actually killed 20% of the world at that time. When the European colonists would go to places like Australia, for example, they'd spread the flu and influenza with them and wiping out the Aboriginal people. The similar thing happened in North and South America, in New Zealand, and lots of other places like that. 20% of the world died just from the flu. But then during the British Raj and during China's century of humiliation, 12.5% of the people of the world's population was killed. And to put those disasters into some sort of context, the combined death toll of World War I and World War II killed only 2% of the world's population. So we've gone through huger disasters like this. Now, have a look at the information age and the crises we've gone through already. COVID-19 killed only 0.1% of us. It was probably the most shocking thing that's happened in our recent lifetime so far, but only 0.1% of us were affected by that. Meanwhile, the war on terrorism has killed 0.0005% of the world's population. Still a lot of people, but really a drop in the bucket compared to the First or Second World War, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the War of the Three Kingdoms. So we've gone through these terrible calamities before, but in those times, the world's population was very small, meaning there weren't that many of us to kill. Now that there's so many more of us, I think it's really almost an understatement to assume that only 10% of the world's population will be killed in the next big calamity. The number could actually be higher. I mean, if something as terrible as, let's say, a Mongol invasion, not a Mongol invasion, as a colonial war takes place, well, that would be about 1.5 billion. So we could be looking at a bigger death toll. We just don't know yet. So my 1 billion number, that's more of an estimate based on several factors, including history here. But I got another question on what will the impact on the housing industry be if the population declines like this? And that's a tough one to answer because I think you're looking for an opportunity in all this chaos. My thinking would be best not to look to profit from a declining world population. Who knows if you'll be around on the other side of that decline or not. But I suppose logically speaking, if the world population goes from 10 billion down to 9 billion, yes, there'll be a lot of vacant houses on the market, meaning house prices should be falling after that period. But I don't want you focused on that because that's just like the wrong focus to have altogether. I suppose the other observation we should have here is to have a look at how warfare has changed over each age. During the industrial age, wars got more and more terrible, meaning, probably what's the best example here? Nuclear bombs, the biggest weapons of our era, they can destroy an entire city. You couldn't destroy an entire city in the Bronze Age. People would come in, they'd rape, pillage, and murder whoever they could, but they wouldn't destroy an entire city because they didn't have the capability for it. As technology gets bigger and bigger, we could assume the death toll gets worse and worse in the years ahead with every war. So let's hope that's not the case, but most likely with tech development being what it is, people make bigger bombs and bigger airplanes, bigger aircraft carriers, things like that in the years ahead. So that was one series of questions, where to live and how to survive. There were other questions about practicality on how to survive within the country that you live in. And there were questions on should I just get lots of guns and ammunition and stuff like that. I don't really want to answer yes or no on that, but I do want to share a couple anecdotes with you. And I want to tell you the story of my friend Chris. Now, I met this guy about 14 or 15 years ago. He lives in Sydney. He's probably in his 50s or 60s. At the time I met him, he was a fundamentalist Christian. And not like a crazy fundamentalist Christian. I mean, like an apocalyptic fundamentalist Christian. He thought the world was going to end in 2012 and that Jesus would come down from heaven and, the whole world would destroy itself. It said about that time the Mayan calendar was supposed to be ending, and there was predictions about the world ending in that time as well. However, he survived the second coming of Christ in 2012. And in fact, when Jesus didn't come down from the clouds in that time, he completely turned against Christianity. He went from a fundamentalist Christian into a fundamentalist atheist. And he was on that path for many years, talking about how the Christians are stupid and they don't know anything, even though he used to be one. And then COVID hit. And then he's almost lost his mind to some degree now. He's not sure if he wants to be a fundamentalist Christian again, expecting the next end of the world, or if he wants to be a fundamentalist atheist and expecting nothing bad to ever happen again. The reason I mention his story is I want you guys to prepare your mind to adapt to any given situation, not necessarily just to survive any potential disasters that happen in the years ahead. You don't want to go from one extreme to the other. You want to be as flexible as you possibly can. And look at your life so far. Actually, I'll give you my own life as an example. I'm in my mid-40s, and when I was a kid, I was told that the Cold War, that nuclear bombs during the Cold War were going to destroy everyone. And I survived that calamity. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were told that all the satellite states were going to get into a nuclear war with each other, and they would destroy all of humanity. And of course, that didn't happen. And then there was the Y2K bug, which was supposed to destroy all of humanity, and that didn't happen. Then there was the Mayan calendar in 2012 that was going to kill everyone. That didn't happen. And then there was COVID-19 that was going to kill all of us, and we survived all of these. So in my lifetime already, I've survived 5 end-of-the-world scenarios, which is about one every decade, just on average here. Let's assume that there'll be one every decade in the years ahead, of which the one towards the end of this decade is going to be bad. The one towards the end of the 2030s is going to be horrendous. So your goal isn't to survive these problems, it's to adapt and be able to change to changing circumstances during those times. And I suppose the general lesson here is just apply some common sense here to find out how best to survive. By the way, that friend of mine, Chris, when he was going through his Christian fundamentalist phase, he had a successful business, he sold it, he bought a hobby farm, grew his own vegetables, set up solar power years before everyone else was doing it, just started waiting for the second coming. Those are practical steps, but they're not rational steps. You want to take practical steps with rationality and combine the two. So let me talk about that. In my previous video, I talked about having some sort of food security. And one question I got a lot from you guys is, how much food do I need? And what exactly is food security? Now, my prediction is that there's going to be some kind of deflation, financial deflation happening in the years ahead. And when that takes place, there's always going to be trouble getting food because the value of your currency goes down, which makes food more expensive. So to answer how much food you need, you've probably got to look at how much time you need to survive or how much time you can survive in between having a stable income. Now, natural disasters last for weeks. So if there's a flood or a plague or famine or something, it'll take a few weeks before the rest of the world can start to send in supplies to you or before your supermarket shelves start to fill up again. So if you're planning for that type of scenario, plan to have food to last you and your family for a couple weeks. The COVID lockdowns, they went on for months and months at a time. And depending on which part of the world you lived in, you're probably locked down 2, maybe 3 times. On each occasion, thankfully, the supermarkets were open. However, if you lived in a part of the world where that wasn't possible, you needed enough food to survive for a few months. Now, then I suppose the other way to look at it is that the Great Depression and some of the terrible wars that we faced as a species, they tend to go on for years and years. And during these times, it's very hard to get food. So my advice is, if you have a backyard, start growing food now. Plant those trees at the moment so that in the years to come, you have some sort of fruit or some sort of vegetables that you can eat for yourself and your family. Think of it more as a supplement to what hopefully should be available for everyone else, but just in case it gets really hard at that time, you've got this as a backup. Now, if by chance you don't have a backyard and you just live in a unit or a flat and you just have a small balcony, start planting those herbs or those smaller trees and plants now for the same reason, so that in the years ahead, you can have some fruit-bearing plants or trees there. One other observation I suppose I should make is in Sydney, the city where I live, during COVID, people started to stockpile toilet paper. And I couldn't understand this at the time because during lockdowns, toilet paper is not a life-saving necessity here. Yet everyone in my neighborhood apparently just went crazy because all the supermarkets were sold out of toilet paper. All the pastas, the rice, the beans, the long shelf life food, that stayed exactly where it was, but everyone went to toilet paper. I don't want you guys being the people rushing after toilet paper in the years ahead. I want you being the guys who walk into the pasta aisle of your supermarket and pick up that long shelf life food, because that's going to be the thing that saves you in the years ahead. And on that note, in the years ahead, I'll put out a video on when to begin stockpiling that long life food. Remember, there are things like grains and pastas and all this that can last on your shelf for up to 10 years. So if you really are looking at surviving for years and years, and let's say you live in a part of the world where it really does hit the fan, then you want a lot of this in your pantry just so you can get through that difficult period. Another point I made in the previous video was I recommended that you try and accumulate 20 ounces of silver per family member. And I got a question on why 20 ounces specifically. So let me just say firstly, 20 ounces of silver is worth around about $600 in today's money. So if you have a family of 4, you want about 80 ounces of silver. And the idea to accumulate this isn't so much for an investment. You're not looking to have that 600 turn into maybe $1,000, then you sell it and then you make a profit. The point of this silver, it's that it's for trading, meaning you can give up a silver coin or a 1 ounce silver coin and get, I don't know, a couple loaves of bread or some equivalent in food if and when you need it. Throughout history, whenever there's a societal collapse, gold and silver have always been the saving graces of people who save these things. So my estimation is you'll probably need about 20 ounces per family member. That's why I recommend that. Now, another question I got was, when will colleges become redundant? I think this question was asked by a parent whose kids are about to go to college. And my answer to that is colleges are actually already become redundant. In fact, if you look at the trend right now, colleges don't really prepare kids for their careers. Half of the colleges just brainwash and indoctrinate kids politically. The other half just set kids up to get their first job. And it's in their first job that they get the training to do their job for the rest of their career. So colleges are already redundant. In fact, if you look at the trend of online colleges over the last 10 or 20 years, you'll notice that they're actually starting to take over. You no longer need to do a $40,000, $50,000 degree sitting in a classroom in a very expensive building anymore. You can do it on your living room on your laptop for a fraction of the cost. I think that trend is going to continue. So not only will the institutions and the buildings themselves shift into becoming online, but I think very soon the curriculums themselves might start to become redundant. I went to university as a software engineer in the late 90s. And at that point in time, I started up an internet company in Sydney, and I was learning more through my internet company than I was at my university. In fact, the first subject that they taught us about the internet was probably in my second or third year of college. So the university was around about 5 years behind the practical business world there. This gap between theory and reality, the theory of universities I mean, that's just going to widen and widen in the years ahead. That's how we can predict that curriculums are going to become more and more redundant in the years ahead. And after that happens, teachers will actually start to be replaced by AI. There's so much I can say on this. I'll just leave that as just a single sentence. Teachers will start to be replaced by AI at some point in the future. And when that happens, the institutions themselves are going to start to collapse. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because remember, the future is going to be ruled by Jupiter, which is teachers. So the future will be ruled by teachers. And I suppose what I should talk about now is how I'm guiding my own kids through this period. So I've got two sons, one is 14 and one is 16. My 16-year-old wants to be a video game designer. He's incredibly creative, loves computers and just that sort of thing. So rather than get him into maybe an arts college, I'm trying to get him into a software engineering college with a speciality in video game design. So I think that industry is going to be booming in the years ahead. My second son, he's got a very technical kind of brain. He loves like breaking things and putting them back together. So he's probably going to have a career in either robotics or maybe software engineering or maybe electronics engineering in some capacity. Basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at my sons and their separate talents. I'm trying to figure out what skills they've got, or rather what talents they've got, from which we can develop their skills, which will be employable in the future. Remember, the future skills, the ones that will be the highest in demand, are information age skills. So the follow-up question to that, because in the previous video, I talked about, I gave an example of rather than getting your son into an arts college, get him into a graphic design college. I was actually taking my own son's example from that. So one person asked, won't AI get rid of arts-based jobs? I don't think so specifically. It'll get rid of the type of artwork that you produce maybe on YouTube channels or thumbnails or things like that. It won't actually get rid of creativity altogether. Human ingenuity, there's always going to be a need for that. Okay, so then we got a lot of questions. What are some information age jobs? And people were asking, can you give us a list of jobs, or what are the best jobs for people in their teens, 20s and 30s, or in their 40s? And I don't actually have an answer for that, because I think there's going to be lots and lots of jobs available in the future. They're just going to be more geared towards technology and the information age, and they'll be less geared towards the industrial age. So if I could give you one piece of advice for your kids, it's not to get them into the industrial age, it's to get them more into the information age. So if your kid wants to, for example, work on a motor car assembly line, like people did in the industrial age, there's probably not a good future in that. But if your kid wants to start designing cars as using a information age template, it's probably going to be far more successful in that. So send them into professions from other ages if you like, just not into industrial age jobs. Then we had other questions. What are the work-home lifestyles like of information age people? So I want you guys to have a look at a couple trends that are going on here, one of which is the work from home trend. A new phrase that's come up over the past few decades has been that of the digital nomad. People who live in lots of different countries and they just work off their laptop, one week off a cafe in Thailand and the next week off a beach in Spain type of thing. I know so many of you guys in our Chariot Palmistry community that are actually living this lifestyle now. But then after COVID-19, everybody started working from home for a little while. So this is a trend that's been going on before COVID, got ramped up during COVID. Now the world's kind of in two camps here. Should we all go back to work, or should we keep working from home? Will this work from home trend continue? The simple answer to that is to figure out which is more efficient, which of the two options is more efficient. I think working from home is going to end up winning because it's cheaper for a business owner to run, and whether an employee's productivity rises or falls as they work from home, that's largely a moot point. If a company doesn't need to buy big expensive offices in order to be competitive, then they're not going to buy big expensive offices. So I think the work from home trend is going to continue. But I suppose the other thing to look at is that the information age, I believe, will also be ruled by Jupiter, which is a planet that brings wisdom. And I'll talk more about wisdom and lifestyle and how the two are interconnected in just a minute. But what I want you to have a look at is when you're working from home, theoretically, you're spending more time with your family. You're actually starting to build your personal life stronger than you're building your professional life. That is a trend I think will have to continue in the years ahead. Keep in mind also that the industrial age, as it declines, it's declining under the influence of Rahu. And Rahu brings illusion. It's the promise that if you spend 40 years working in a job, then you can have a happy retirement. It doesn't give you the rewards right now. It gives you the illusion or the idea that you'll get that reward. And during this industrial age decline, the whole family structure has been falling apart. So regardless of how the way the world goes, have a look at the type of lifestyle that you would like. Would you like to have the life where you spend more time with your family? Or would you like the type of life where after working 40 years, then you can spend time with your family? Do you follow wisdom or do you follow ignorance? You have to pick there. So the next question then is, what about the mindset and mental illnesses that will take place in the information age? Now, to answer this, let me just ask about your mental health. And the question, did COVID-19 rattle you? With all the lockdowns that happened, there was a huge spike in depression and anxiety that went on in that time. My own sort of personal experience in doing readings for lots and lots of people around the world, what I noticed is most people who went through COVID, their lives were split into two different camps. On the one hand, there were people who completely self-destructed, people who were in not so good marriages when the lockdown started, and then as a result of the lockdowns, they ended up getting divorced, which spiraled into more depression and more difficulties with their mental health. Meaning, if their life was falling apart before COVID, then COVID made it a lot worse. Then there were another group of people who were trying to get their life together. They were meditating, exercising, trying to eat right, but their life just wasn't falling into place. Then COVID happened, and then they had time to get their life together. And so COVID pretty much was a great period for a large number of people because they started to get their life together. So my thinking of like that whole lockdown period here is it actually just accelerated the way your life was going. If it was self-destructing before, it made that happen quicker. If you were building your life or trying to build your life, that construction happened a whole lot quicker too. So the key takeaway here is during this future period of change, I want you to focus on your own mindset. I want you to find a way that you can succeed. Meaning, if you just do the basic things of meditation, exercise, and eating well, then you're starting to build a better future for yourself. In the years ahead, as all this chaos happens around the world, your life will accelerate for the better. There's an old Taoist saying, to do nothing and achieve everything. What that means is just lay the foundations for your life and let the results come to you. As the world's falling apart and as chaos is happening everywhere, like it did in COVID, your life will keep getting better. So that's about you at an individual level, but what about society as a whole? It's probably just going to be a simple repeat of COVID. Now, remember, COVID was a virus-based lockdown that everyone went through, but very soon we'll probably have finance-based lockdowns, war-based crises, and things like that in the years ahead. So the specific cause of the crisis won't be important. It's how society reacts to it. In the city that I live in Sydney, some people were losing their minds over having to wear face masks. Some people were losing their minds over having to take vaccines. I was actually in the camp of taking the vaccine because that's what the doctors told me to. And in hindsight, I actually think that was a mistake for me. But that's just for me personally, not trying to tell you guys how to think on that one. But society is probably going to lose its mind in the years ahead. Half of the people will be right, half the people will be wrong. And as we go through the chaos, we won't know who is right and who is wrong until hindsight kicks in. So don't sort of tie yourself down into any one particular train of thought. Again, remember, be as adaptable as you can. Now, I suppose the other thing here is to remember that Jupiterians are going to be the people who succeed the most in the years ahead. and Jupiter loves people who meditate. So, sorry to sound like a broken record on this, make sure you meditate. And whilst you're doing that, make sure you're exercising and eating healthy too. These three things alone are going to boost your mental health. Now, the other side of this is that new tech is being developed in the background of the world that's going to help people with mental illness. As aside from the palmistry work I do, I also have a health tech company where we're putting frequencies or embedding frequencies into music to help people with mental illness, to help people sleep better, help clear their depression, with women's health and all that sort of thing. So I know of a lot of other companies that are developing really cool methodologies at the moment to actually help people's mental illness in the years ahead. So things are actually going to get a lot better than what they are now. So that's one area. I did also get a lot of questions on commodities. One in particular was, how will the information age affect the coming bull market on commodities? So a couple observations here. The first is to figure out which are the most useful and necessary commodities in the years ahead. And have a look at iron in today's world. Now, during the Iron Age, the Iron Age needed iron because that formed the basis of society. We still use iron today, but it isn't the foundation of who we are as a people anymore. So even though iron is being mined today and it's, I suppose, numerically more expensive than what it was back in the Iron Age, we're not relying on iron to build our future, meaning iron spears or iron shields anymore. And the same thing with the Bronze Age. We still use bronze today, but we're not in the Bronze Age. And for that matter, some industries still use stones, even though we're no longer in the Stone Age. So we're always going to need material resources. We just have to figure out which are the most important resources in the information age. So have a look at the biggest technologies that are being built or that are on the horizon, then figure out what are the minerals and resources needed to build that. So look at things like EV or solar power. What minerals will they need? And that's lithium, cobalt, and silver. By the way, just as a side anecdote to all of this, in addition to the palmistry, in addition to the music health tech company, I also have a crystal shop here in Sydney. We've been running for nearly 20 years, so we're one of the oldest crystal shops in Sydney, but we've got a lot of contacts in the mining world where we buy the crystals and minerals. And I've been talking to one guy who's from Brazil. He used to supply us with little cobalt samples or minerals years and years ago. And he told me he can't source this stuff anymore because the price of cobalt's gone up so much because all these companies are buying this one particular mineral to put into their batteries. So, yeah, people in the industry have seen this coming years ago. It's just starting to hit the headlines right now. But EV and solar power, the three main minerals, lithium, cobalt, and silver. Now, if you believe that quantum computing is going to be a big thing in the years ahead, then you want to have a look at the main metals and minerals for that industry. That's rare earths, silver, and aluminium. So that would be a good place to look at. What about the minerals for AI? That is copper, rare earths, and silver. And what are the main minerals for robotics? Steel, aluminium, rare earths, and gold and silver. Now, I'm hoping you guys can start to see a pattern here. There are a few metals or a few minerals that come up in that list over and over again. So if you were to align your investment strategy along these lines, then those would be the areas to look at. But then I suppose the follow-up question is, what about today's multi-billion-dollar industries? What about oil, which I suppose technically is a multi-trillion-dollar industry? Now, I believe that oil is a byword for energy, and that is an industrial age resource, which means demand for this must go down in the years ahead. And then there's iron, and that's probably just going to continue along as it is. As I said, we needed iron in the Iron Age. We're going to need it now in the Information Age. Then there's other metals like gold, silver, platinum, palladium. These are known as precious metals because they were once monetary metals. And we don't know for sure if they're going to become monetary metals in the future. What we do know for sure is that all four of these metals do have information age applications. Meaning if you want to build robots, you're going to need some silver and you're going to need some palladium. If you want to build EV cars, you're going to need platinum or palladium in some quantities here. So demand for this should be going up in the years ahead. The other question, I suppose, on the other side of that is if some mining industries are going to boom and others are going to collapse, what's going to happen to the countries that depend on these resources for mining income? And as I said before, the Middle East, which has lots of countries whose economies are dependent on oil, are probably going to be declining. Whereas other countries like Australia or Canada that have a lot of mining activity, they're probably going to be rising because of these commodities in the years ahead. So that's where I want to leave this video with all the questions you guys asked. I do want to tease the next video in this series. And that video series is going to be about what books should you be reading to get an idea of this. And just as a quick tease on this one, I'll be focusing in on the Vishnu Puran. And that's a book about the incarnations of Vishnu, who is the Hindu god who incarnates on earth at the end of every era. And he creates a new world. Now, that particular book was written at the end of the Bronze Age and at the start of the Iron Age. So it's a book solely dedicated on how to survive a societal or an end of an era and the rebirth of another one. But not only does it talk about the end of that particular age, it talks about what happens at the end of every age and how it's reborn. So for most of this series so far, I've tried as hard as possible to stay away from talking about religion. But in this next video, I'll be talking a lot about Hinduism, I'll be talking about Christianity, and a lot of the older books of wisdom to give you guys some insight on this. All right, guys, that's where I'm going to end this video. Thank you very much.